I've always wanted to know how long it would take me from start to finish to make a sourdough version of Irish soda bread. So this week, I set my timer and got to work. Since you can pretty much start baking Irish soda bread right after mixing, the first thing I did was preheat my oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit so the oven would be ready to go. For one large loaf of sourdough soda bread, I added 350 grams of buttermilk to my mixing bowl. Even though this is the only liquid that traditional soda bread calls for, I wanted to take advantage of an extra 100 grams of sourdough starter that I had on hand, which I'd fed and never ended up using. So I added that too. Since baking soda is the ingredient that will be making this soda bread rise instead of yeast or sourdough starter, you can use either sourdough discard or active sourdough starter in this recipe. Either one will work, it's just for the flavoring and not for the rise. Once your 100 grams of sourdough is added to the buttermilk, mix it very thoroughly to combine. I recommend using a whisk or a dough whisk if you have one. Since you won't actually be kneading this extremely wet dough, any chunks of starter that don't get whisked into the liquid now will end up showing up in the final bread later. Not very nice at all. When the starter has fully incorporated into the buttermilk, you can begin adding the dry ingredients right into the same bowl. Start with 450 grams of all-purpose flour. Soda breads usually use a lower protein wheat flour, so for the US kitchen, stick with all-purpose flour, but you can use bread flour in a pinch. The results will only be slightly different. Next, add 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, about 5 grams, and 3/4 of a teaspoon of baking soda, about 5 grams again. This will be just enough salt to enhance the tangy flavor of the buttermilk, and just enough baking soda to make the bread rise without leaving a chemically aftertaste. Once the ingredients are all together in the bowl, mix everything together thoroughly with a spoon, a dough whisk, or even your hand. Irish soda breads are quick breads that require very minimal kneading. You want the bread to end up tender and soft, and excessive kneading will lead to a chewier and denser bread. Here's how I like to approach the mixing process for this particular recipe. Once I've brought the dough together with my whisk and it starts to get too hard to stir, then I switch to my hands and I try to pick up all the dry flour that's still in the mixing bowl in as few kneading motions as possible. This usually takes less than 1 minute. I'm not focusing on the dough, I'm just focusing on picking up the dry flour that's around the bowl. Once I've picked up most of that dry flour, I call it quits because I don't want to over knead the dough. When you've got a dough that looks something like this, you can move on to shaping and baking. You have a couple baking vessel options. You can bake this on a parchment paper lined sheet pan, but I personally like to bake my soda bread on a cast iron pan that I grease with a little bit of butter. The cast iron pan and butter combo is non-stick. It also provides a little bit of flavor to the bread. Definitely not necessary, so use parchment paper if you want to. As I was transferring my dough directly onto my cast iron pan, my kitchen timer beeped and that reminded me that I'm trying to make this as fast as possible, so I had to get a move on. I just gently shaped the dough into a round on top of the cast iron pan, then I patted down the dough just a little bit with my hands to flatten it. Next, it was time to score or cut the dough. Traditionally, soda breads seem to be scored by pressing the sharp end of a chef's knife down deeply into the dough until it almost hits the table. But I decided to score mine in a cross pattern with my serrated bread knife. Either method seems to work fine. The cuts or score marks will allow the dough to rise up beautifully in the oven as it bakes. Speaking of baking, once you score your dough, you can move it directly into your oven, which has already been preheated to 450 degrees Fahrenheit. The acid in the buttermilk and sourdough starter are already reacting with the baking soda to make this bread rise, so the time to bake is now. Set your timer for 50 minutes. That's as long as it should take for this bread to bake. 50 minutes later, my sourdough Irish soda bread was looking piping hot, gloriously brown, and dare I say, deadly. I wanted to make this fast, but I didn't want to make it undercooked, so I did check the internal temperature of the soda bread to make sure it was reaching at least 190 degrees Fahrenheit. That's around 90 degrees Celsius, 92 degrees Celsius, somewhere around there. With the internal temperature checking out, I moved this over to a wire rack to cool. It's fun baking breads that are out of my routine for a change. Whereas regular sourdough bread is purposefully chewy and airy, this soda bread is tender and has a more closed crumb. Whereas sourdough bread has a complex fermented dough flavor, this soda bread has a simpler, tangy flavor that only buttermilk can provide. This bread is perfect to eat with a pat of butter or a bit of apple butter or jam. I've also eaten it alongside soup and it has been the perfect accompaniment. Now, drumroll please, how long did it actually take me to bake a loaf of sourdough Irish soda bread from start to finish? Just 1 hour and 15 minutes. This may be the ultimate last-minute bread. Maybe the Irish are onto something.